Hello, my name is Yamna Boukaabar, and the title of my presentation is Humor in Poetry, Robert Frost's Mending Wall. So a quick little overview of my presentation. Today I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on Robert Frost as a humorist and a poet. Then I'll give you a little introduction on my main claim and argument, followed by my thesis and my argument, which is going to explore 4 humor theories and strategies: subversion, misdirection, irony, and absurdity. After that, I'm going to touch on my methodology and then wrap it up with my conclusions. So quick little background on Robert Frost. He was a humorist. He was known for incorporating lots of humor in his poetry. And this concept of play, he described in his own words as play, no matter how deep, has got to be so playful that the audience are left in doubt whether it is deep or shallow. So here's this concept of, is it something deep and meaningful, or does it have no meaning? Is it just for pure enjoyment purposes? And he discusses this again further in a letter to a friend. He said he has never been so serious as when he is joking. So already he's establishing he's a person who he plays between the seriousness and this comedy, and this can be seen in his work. When he was getting a bit more famous, his wife died in 1938, and she was one of his main critics. And so now he's left without a critic. And so according to Sandra Katz, author of Robert Frost, humorist, when his wife died and now he doesn't have anyone to, as she put it, temper him, his later work was becoming more criticized. It was described as painful, unnerving, a corny failure. And this is because, she says, he was now overtly sarcastic rather than delicately ironic. And that was because he experienced a lot of things in life. He had his wife die, he had his mother die, he had his children die, some of them. One of his sons committed suicide. So he had a lot of things, and that came across in his work. It was a lot. As she said, it wasn't tempered anymore. It wasn't delicately ironic, and that was shown in his criticisms. But the poem we're going to explore today, The Mending Wall, is one of his earlier poems. So we'll be able to see that subtlety, that delicate irony Katz is talking about. So what is poetic humor? Let's define an established definition. Gary Fine, sociologist Gary Fine, defines it as humorous communication that have as their intended results the creation of amusement. However, no, intended excludes unintended amusement. So Robinson and Smith-Levin point this out, and they kind of amend the definition and add to it, or having the results of amusement. So for our purposes, humor is going to be something that elicits amusement or has the results of amusement, intentionally or unintentionally. And so now that we have the humor, now that we know what the humor is, where does it come from? And French Poet Baudelaire describes it as perpetual collisions. So two opposing things that meet. And James Cody Walker kind of takes this idea even further and describes it as the interaction of the funny and the frightening. So this is where the humor is coming from. This kind of clash between this comedic and this frightening. But what is the purpose of this conflict? What is the point of having an interchangeability between something funny and something scary? Plato just says, and we're going to go take this back to Plato, who describes serious things cannot be understood without laughable things, nor opposites at all without opposites. So humor is there to convey a message that might be hard to convey. Humor is there for tempering a difficult message. Humor is there to, sometimes it is the only feasible response when faced with something grim or horrifying. And this brings me to my thesis. In his poem, Mending Wall, Robert Frost uses humor theories and strategies such as subversion, irony, and absurdity, and misdirection to highlight conflicting values between the individual, society, and nature. So let's get right into the argument. The first point, subversion. Well, what is subversion? According to Dan O'Shannon, author of What Are You Laughing At? A Comprehensive Guide to the Comedic Event, subversion is the railing against authority through comedy. It is comedy that pushes the boundaries of social acceptability. So think of comedy that is defiant, comedy that appeals to the anarchist. And in the Mending Wall, this is seen throughout the poem. So from the very act of rebuilding the wall is an implicit agreement between the man and his neighbor. It is unspoken, but they do it every year. It's a sort of social contract of sorts. And despite the narrator not agreeing at all with the existence of the wall, he still goes to initiate the mending. He's the one who goes to let the neighbor know. Even though he finds the wall, he doesn't see any purpose in it. And he even cheekily thinks, what if he tells the neighbor that it's elves who are responsible for the deterioration of the wall? And so this is that comedic element, this idea of thinking of elves, and also him kind of making fun of his neighbor, and the stodginess, uptightness of his neighbor who insists that good walls make good neighbors. But this has been contrasted with the author, this lightheartedness it's contrasted with the author who describes the neighbor as in darkness. So now we have this idea of sticking to tradition despite it serving no purpose. So, and this is where the subversion comes in, because it's appealing. While it's very lighthearted and comedic, it's also appealing to those anti-government descendants, that anti-authority, or it's also an appeal to that everyday citizen who is sick of doing these tasks that our government tells us to do, that might feel purposeful, that might feel really repetitive. It is, while at the same time it's funny, this idea of elves, it also reveals this conflict between the self, who desires to, be free of society's control, who desires to, act upon their own will, and then also the frightening level of control that society has, and the influence of archaic social traditions. And as outdated and as useless as they may seem, they still have so much control. So that humor there really highlights that conflict. And then this moves me on to my next tool, which is misdirection. And so misdirection is defined by James Cody Walker in his book, Oh Ho, Alas, Alas, Poetry and Difficult Laughter. And he defines misdirection as when a poem's formal elements, rhyme, meter, stanzaic pattern, do not prepare us for its argument or impact. So in essence, misdirection is when the poem sets us up for something and we're expecting something, and then what we get later on is the opposite of what we were expecting. And so this poem, The Mending Wall, kind of does that from the get-go, starting off with something there is that doesn't love a wall. So already starting off from the get-go, we are, this sets us up for something mysterious, mystical, like what is going on? And then it's revealed that it's the frozen ground well and the sun. So it's literally just nature. So what we were expecting, something interesting, mystical, that's what the poem sets us up to expect, or that's what the poem, kind of makes it seem like, and then it's something else. So that's their misdirection. And then the narrator, even himself, offers something to kind of satisfy that curiosity, and offers, maybe it was elves, he offers that. So that's that comedic element, and it's exciting, it's lighthearted, but at the same time, it is highlighting, the truth, something almost grim about the reality of nature, and that how insufficient man is when compared to nature. How no matter how many times the men rebuild that wall, nature is so powerful, and it will always tear that wall down. So you have that lightheartedness, that idea of, oh, we were set up to expect something mystical, that suspension, that excitement, and then that, oh wow, it was nature, and then, oh, maybe it's elves, but it's not elves exactly. So that whole humorous, lighthearted setup, but also it's countered by this grim reality that compared to nature, you know, man is nothing. So it's highlighting this man versus nature conflict and how man is basically nothing. On to my next point, irony. So Dan O'Shannon defines irony as if a character or a society needs to accomplish a specific goal, an ironic twist might determine that it is achieved in an unexpected way, or that the goal is achieved but produces the opposite of the intended effect. And the whole premise of the poem is ironic. It's ironic that the men are meeting to build a wall, and that is the only time that they meet. In the poem, that's the only mention of the day they meet. There's no other mention of them meeting. So they come together. So the only time they come together is to work on something to keep them even more apart. And another, and to this, the only appropriate response you can give is kind of a humorous kind of laughter to this. Otherwise, it's just you're left with this grim, oh. And this is repeated again because it's also ironic that the man is so offended. He's not so offended. He finds the wall as, you know, he thinks the wall is something that gives offense, which is also a pun to offense right there, but he still works on it. So he is working on, despite finding it offensive, he will only ever be able to find any sort of togetherness when he is actively enforcing his own isolation, which is that contrast again between the self and society. In order to uphold that social contract of good walls make good neighbors, he has to go against his own feelings and his own self-interest. And again, the irony here, it is offered as sort of dissipating, not completely the tension, but it is a response to the tension. It doesn't solve anything by any means, but it is kind of countering this grim immutability of the neighbor who firmly, the only thing he ever says is good walls make good neighbors. And so you have that humor versus this very stoic, very firm neighbor. And then on to the final point is absurdity. And so Thomas Nagel in the Journey of Philosophy, The Absurd, describes absurdity as the collision between the seriousness with which we take our lives and the perpetual possibility of regarding everything about which we are serious as arbitrary or open to doubt. So basically it's seriousness, this again, a collision between seriousness and nothing really matters. And from the get-go, good walls make good neighbors. The neighbor is very serious about this. He's very firm. Good walls make good neighbors. It's the only thing he says, but the wall doesn't really matter. And he likes having the thought of it so well. But as the narrator points out, his apple trees will never cross and eat the cones of the neighbor's pines. So the whole purpose of the wall is ridiculous. It's preposterous. This whole idea of apple trees crossing and eating the cones is also ridiculous and amusing. But at the same time, it's countered with this frightening element, this frightening aspect of the old stone savage, and how the men wear their fingers rough by handling the boulders. So while you have this lighthearted outdoor game where they're using spells, it's a very amusing idea, you have this countered by they are actually, this grim reality that they are actually physically harming themselves in order to get this done, this task that is really ridiculous, really useless, that is just going to have to be repeated. So again, it's another conflict between that self and society and its demands, its rigorous demands, even at the expense of one's own health and one's own wealth, and one's own self. So the methodology of this was, it was a qualitative study, and it was a literature review and analysis of the poem Mending Wall. And in both conflicts, in self versus society and man versus nature, humor is used interchangeably with some sort of frightening element. And while the humor does not make the reality of the situation go away, it is an effective device of lightening the tone and makes the tension more manageable, more palpable. The conflict is highlighted in a more comfortable way, an entertaining way almost, and the humor tools and theories each reveal some sort of conflicting value, perhaps between seeking freedom and seeking your own well-being versus respecting authority, or perhaps between the conflict that comes with the limited capabilities of man versus the abominable versus the great force that is nature. So it is, as Baudelaire put it, perpetual collisions that are explaining this humor in this poetry. And this idea of perpetual collisions and interchangeability of what is scary and what is humorous can be applied to everyday communication as well. In certain situations, humor is the most appropriate response to tension. Humor may help convey a horrifying message in a more agreeable manner. And sometimes when communicating a grim or frightening message, there really is nothing you can do but laugh. Thank you.